Hello everyone, this is the Southern Hellenist. I am back with another video. I want to apologize for not doing the libation to Hermes tonight. I had planned to do it, but unfortunately we were hit really hard at work with customers. Firehouse Subs next door actually closed their location, and so customers that would have gone over to Firehouse to get food actually is coming over to our store to get food. And so it actually is thoroughly exhausting, and I was like, no, I can't do a ritual tonight. I'm just too dead tired to do it. But I'm not too dead tired to do this video. I did get some sleep, about an hour worth of sleep. Um, and yeah. So I was going to do a video about slavery in ancient Greece and Rome. I have decided to go ahead and do that video despite not having the book that I wanted to get. And there actually is a website called Great Courses. A lot of people on YouTube, especially people that do like academic type of videos, they do sponsor Great Courses. So we are going to talk about slavery just in ancient Greece, because I could include Rome. I probably will. I always seem to make a mistake in just going into that area. And talk also about slavery in ancient Rome. And, my channel is educational as well as fun. I do, the fun part is showing off the shrines and the cool stuff I buy off the internet, especially off of Etsy. I'm going to try to keep it to ancient Greece if possible. So, when the church was going around and they were burning documents and historical evidence and stuff like that, they decided to keep evidence of slavery in ancient Greece pretty much intact, because it was something that that they practiced themselves. So why not keep it? They kept it. So one of the things that I must stress, and I really need to stress this, and I can't stress this hard enough. Slavery in ancient times had absolutely nothing to do with your pigmentation of your skin. I kind of get a little bit angry about people that focus solely on slavery from African slaves, and I want to say this, okay? That fucking sucked, okay? You're exploiting an entire continent for your own fucking greed. Sorry, I don't support that. And they ignore that. They ignore the fact is that people have enslaved their own people for hundreds of thousands of years. I think they say human beings have only been around for 150,000 years or something like that. So we don't have evidence of who enslaved the first person. Just like there's no evidence that religion was started by the first person who conned the first victim. But we have evidence from people that have done research on the evolution of society that will tell you that religion basically essentially got started because people were being killed. People were being killed for their crops. And the people that were left behind had to figure out, okay, where do you go when you die? And that was a question that they have had for a very long time. So, when we talk about slavery in ancient Greece, We got to understand something a little bit about Greece in general. Greece was not a unified nation. This was what Rome exploited when they went to conquer Greece. They knew that the Greeks fought among themselves. They knew the Greeks were not a unified country. They knew that there was no Greek empire. So when they went there to conquer Greece, they had to conquer each individual city-state and finally put that country solely into Roman hands. So, slavery was a very important part of Greek society. I can bet whatever that the Greeks did not know how to dress themselves. They did not know how to dress themselves. Slaves knew how to dress themselves, but the rich people did not. And with the kinds of clothing they wore, they could not dress themselves. They literally created outfits that were impossible for them to dress themselves. I can't pronounce it. It's a women's garment. It was a single piece of cloth, but it had folds, and you had to do it a certain way, and to do it, you had to have slaves. Slaves were used for everything. Slaves were used to build the monuments that the free Greeks and some women enjoyed. Greek slaves were not considered citizens of whatever city-state they were in. So they were not considered citizens of Athens. They were not considered citizens of Corinth. They were not considered citizens of Thebes, citizens of this city-state or that city-state. In fact, one of the things that we definitely do very successfully in not recreating is the institution of slavery. But as I said, slavery in ancient Greece had nothing to do with skin color, had nothing to do with what continent that you lived in. It had everything to do if you were on the unlucky end of a battle. For example, is if the city-state of, say, I don't know, sorry about that, Lesbos, or say the island of Lesbos, were conquered by Sparta, for instance. The people of Lesbos, and this is an example, this is just an example, the island of Lesbos would be enslaved by the city-state of Sparta, and they would be put into slavery. Just like if they were conquered by the Athenians or by the people of Thebes, they would be enslaved by that city-state, or they would be sold off to other city-states for a profit. So people that are not from Africa have been enslaved. In fact, if you look at the whole history of slavery, non-Africans have been enslaved longer by other non-Africans, just as Africans have been were enslaved for a very long time by other Africans. That's just society. There's always going to be a section of people that's only job is to ensure that you never have to do any form of work. So, even in Israel, they had slavery, but they had a time limit on how long a person was enslaved. I think it was 7 years, I'm not exactly sure. And then after that, they were given a little slot of land, and they went off their merry little way. So, why would a let's look at Athens, for instance, for a prime example of it. So why would a city-state like Athens enslave other people? Simple, because that is how their society was structured. So I'm going to read from Great Courses. And it says here, although there is no substantial evidence about the first time slavery was created as a form of human exploitation, we do know that it was widespread in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. Greece was not the first nation to practice slavery, but because of its rich literary resources, we have extensive knowledge of how slaves were treated there. Slavery came in different forms and levels. The ideal slave was an inhuman creature with no civic or even biological personality and was treated like a piece of property. But this type of slave did not exist, as no one would fit into these classifications. However, there were different levels of slavery, a kind of hierarchy or spectrum in which slaves were divided, which was based on their quality and conditions. Slavery was not an either-or situation in which you were either free or a slave. It was a continuum. There are very limited accounts of slavery from the point of view of slaves to portray how they felt about being a slave, but we do know how they spent their days as a slave. Regardless, we have extensive knowledge of how the slave owners felt and thought. Having slaves was a universally accepted phenomenon for Greeks, and they grew up with their slaves, formed a kind of friendship with them. It was a very normal practice, and no one considered it a cruel act that had to be abolished. If someone unconsciously felt that slavery was inhuman, instead of questioning its rightness, they would try to treat the slaves humanely and kindly, even if we read in some works of literature that, like that of the Crates, a vision of a technologically advanced future that no one needs to work. That's interesting. It's kind of interesting that the Crates envisioned a world in which no one had to work. That's kind of a dream. Be like, yeah, we're going to write about this world that we may never see, and we still don't see it because everybody has to work. It's not an argument for putting an end to slavery. Even the greatest thinkers could not imagine a world free of slavery, since it was such a established phenomenon interwoven in the cultural heritage of the nation. In the politics, Aristotle classifies slaves into two groups. Slavery by nature and slavery by law. As their name suggests, these members of the first group were born into captivity, while the second was captured or acquired as a result of war or piracy. They were otherwise free human beings enslaved as a result of coincidence. Aristotle believed that the natural-born slave belonged to an inferior human race due to their deformed bodies. What Aristotle missed was that the slaves were not enslaved because of their misshapen bodies. Quite on the contrary, they had misshapen bodies because they were slaves and were forced to do grueling physical work. So a prime example of slavery being used in public works is the building of an aqueduct. For example, when a tyrant, and I cannot do two things. One, I cannot pronounce his name, and two, I cannot remember his name, even if I could pronounce his name. Yes, he had these great builders to plan the aqueduct to deliver fresh water, but it was actually the slaves who actually built it. But they had to follow the plans. He called them, I can't pronounce it, a piece of property that breeds. You would think that a bright mind like Aristotle is expected to have a more humane view on slavery, but it was the collective mindset in that era, and no one was able to think otherwise. The number of slaves in Greece. Clearly there was not a formal register of the number of slaves in ancient Greece, but the historian Paul Cattridge has estimated the number of slaves. compare data from modern slave societies like Brazil and the Caribbean and the Andean South, he expects the number was to be nearly 80,000 to 100,000, with the total population of 250,000 between 450 and 320 BC. This means approximately 1 in 4 of the people in Athens were slaves. Moses Flannery was the first historian to investigate the history of slavery in ancient Greeks. Embarrassed about the historical exploitations of their country, Greek historians did not study the subject. They just said that any person who was free and could afford to have slaves would own a slave attendant to accompany him wherever he went, and a female slave for household chores. The number of slaves a person owned increased based on the wealth of that person. Basically, owning a car is the modern day equivalent of owning a slave. Slavery in ancient Greece did not have any human or civil rights. They were tortured for different reasons. Their owner could beat them whenever he wanted. When their testimony was needed for a lawsuit, they were tortured in confessing to their own guilt or incriminating someone else. They were even forced to have sexual relationships without consent. They were just properties like a table or chair. The only difference was that they were living things. Alright. So that puts it very bluntly about how the slave was viewed. And the belief traveled all the way down. So, now, going off a little bit to the right, as I definitely have a bad habit of doing, we look at Pompeii, for instance. There was a documentary called The Last Day of Pompeii. And it was essentially the last day that these people were alive, before their whole world was turned upside down. And it showed slaves, showed them their household and stuff like that. And what was interesting about it was right at the time when the master of the house realized that him and his family were going to die, he freed all of his slaves. Why? Simple. Because they were all going to die. They were all going to die, and in death, you don't need slaves. You don't need people to wash your body. You don't need people to dress you. You don't need people because you're dead. And so it was his final act as the master of the house and master over his own slaves that he freed them. And they had a choice of leaving. They could have left. They could have left Pompeii. But they knew in the back of their minds that they were doomed. That there was no way that they could leave and get to safety, so they chose to die with their former master. And he gave them a choice. He said, well, you're free now. You don't have to stay behind. But they chose to remain. Not because they could make the choice, but because their logical mind knew that where they were at was the only logical place that they could be at. So it was sad, but it also showed how much power the slave owner had. So getting back to Greece. So slaves, like women, had no rights at all. And I'm actually going to do a video about women in ancient Greece. And they, I mean, they could have a family. I don't know if families were ripped apart. I doubt they were. Um, but, sorry. But they had families. And it was interesting about how much evidence we have about slavery in ancient Greece. And as I said at the very beginning of the video, we have this evidence because the church kept the evidence. They did not burn the documentation of how slaves were treated in ancient Greece. And to them, what they did was not morally wrong. It was not religiously wrong. It was not ethnically wrong, or whatever you want to call it. It was just what they did, and it was not considered a sin to own other human beings. So common questions about the principles of slavery in ancient Greece. How were slaves in Athens treated? Slaves in ancient Greece were treated like pieces of property. For Aristotle, there were pieces of property that breeds. They enjoyed different degrees of freedom and were treated kindly or cruelly depending on the personality of the owner. Now, I do think there was one thing that slave owners could not do, and that is kill their slave for something that they didn't do. I don't know. I'm just thinking that might be it. Where did Athenian slaves come from? The Athenian slaves belonged to two groups. They were either born into slave families or were enslaved after they were captured in wars. How did people become slaves in ancient Greece? People became slaves in ancient Greece after they were captured in wars. They were then sold to their owners. Other slaves were by nature born into slave families. So you read this and it's like, okay, yes, slaves had families. So yeah. Okay, so this is from the Greek Reporter, my favorite website in the whole wide world. Alright, so it says here, slavery in ancient Greece was acceptable and common as in most organized societies of the time, yet there were several differences between city-states. The recorded history of slavery in ancient Greece began during the Mycenaean civilization, as indicated in the numerous tablets unearthed at Pylos. Slaves played an important role in ancient societies since they were used in building temples and other construction works. Particularly, however, they were engaged in the crucial area of agriculture. Female slaves served as maids, nurses, and cooks, and there were craftsmen, artisans, musicians, and others who were enslaved but could live a decent life and earn income as well. So, it tells you that if you were a slave and you were really good at something, that you could actually earn an income from that. So you see that there is a little slight difference between slavery in ancient Greece and slavery in the South. Craftsmen who worked with their masters lived in their own quarters and earned their income at free will. Even the greatest thinker at the time, and there were a great many, could not imagine a world free of slavery since it was such an established phenomenon. Aristotle describes slavery in ancient Greece as natural and necessary. For him, a slave was living property. That indeed was a collective mindset at the time. However, slaves were treated differently, and the conditions under which they lived and worked could vary greatly depending on the time and location in which they lived. In Athens, city-state with a democratic government, people would grow up with their family slaves, and it was not unusual to become friends with them. All right. In Sparta, on the other hand, slaves were treated harshly, and their living conditions were inhumane and humiliated. Now, the prime example of an entire population enslaved was Sparta. It was Sparta. Sparta had the largest population of slaves. And they were the people that established Sparta. I mean, the people that were there. You know, it's really weird. There was more slaves in Sparta than free men. Just, it amazed me when I'm reading this about how there was less Spartans in Sparta than slaves, and they could have easily risen up and revolted against Spartan rule, but they didn't. It's like, and the Spartans knew this. That's why they were afraid of them. You just imagine being a little tiny population among people that were that genetically established that area, and you know at any time if they developed more than 4 brain cells, they could actually overthrow the entire government of Sparta. Just, it amazes me. So, yeah, that was weird. And what's really weird is the Spartans had developed this sense of, we are powerful and nobody can defeat us, and then the Romans came along and, defeated them. There were many sources to supply slaves to the economy. Some of the slaves had been born free, but owing to poverty were sold by their parents into the slave market, which is sad. Other slaves, both men and women, were sold by their own tribes in exchange for goods. A large number of slaves were taken as prisoners of war, captured by the winning army. There are writings that mention the sale of at least 20,000 slaves by Philip II of Macedonia, the father of Alexander the Great. After conquering Scythia, he procured children and women and sold them in the slave markets. Greek slaves came from different cities in Greece, while others came from Egypt and Persia. Slavery in ancient Athens. It was estimated Athens had as many as 80,000 slaves in the 6th and 5th century BC, with an average household having 3 or 4 slaves. The only exception to that rule would be impoverished families. Slaves in ancient Athens were the property of their masters under Athenian law. They could be bought, sold, and beaten, but only by their master. There was also people who were considered public slaves, who were the property of the polis or city-state, thus being sort of elite slaves. You imagine that? Like, I'm a slave, but I'm better than you are. I just cannot imagine somebody actually believing that, but they actually did. If a male slave was freed, he became a metric, a resident alien. After that designation, he could be granted citizenship. Many slaves worked and lived in their master's house, doing all their housework, and in many cases tending to the family's children. Male slaves did the shopping for the household. I am kind of wondering if that's where man's hatred for shopping came from. But it's interesting. If they lived and worked independently, they made periodic payments for their masters. There are written documents recording that slaves were involved in the building of the Eucration and worked in the silver mines of... I cannot pronounce it. Female slaves are known to have as occupations wool working and the retail trade. They were also used as wet nurses for infants. They were also known to work in craft shops around the Angora. Female slaves also worked as prostitutes in brothels and as concubines. However, a concubine had no rights whatsoever. Sometimes a concubine would stay with the man of his house along with his wife. Other times she would be given a separate house to live in which her children would also live. During classical times, slave labor was the main workforce in the craft production industry. Most of the craft factories belonged to wealthy politicians. There are records of Demosthenes, I'm probably butchering the person's name, owning 2 factories which were largely supported by slaves. One of these factories produced swords and had about 30 slaves, while the other used 20 slaves and produced couches. Interesting. Lycurgus, the famous writer, owned the largest production center on record, a shield factory where 120 slaves worked producing the intricate weapons. And you really had to think, you have this factory that makes shields, and you have 120 slaves making these really, really fancy shields with the little fancy designs and stuff. You had to pretty much guess that these slaves knew their shit. They knew how to make swords. They knew how to make shields. So yeah, they knew their shit. Slaves in Sparta. I was, talking about that a little. Criteria describe the situation of slaves in Sparta with these words: the free were more free, and the slaves more fully slaves than elsewhere. In Sparta's city-state, all slaves were owned by the state. They were viewed as enemies and were forced to wear humiliating clothes distinguishing them from Spartans. The Spartans called them heliots, a word still used in Greece today to describe someone who works hard with low pay and in bad conditions. Heliots incredibly outnumbered the citizenry for about 20 to 1. Heliots formed the entire base of the Spartan economy and were essential to food production. However, Spartans treated Heliots like animals and would not allow them to leave the place they served. Heliots were publicly beaten ceremoniously to remind them of their servitude position. Even killing a Heliot was not a punishable act. According to Plutarch, Spartans even forced their slaves to get drunk to show the young Spartans the problem with drinking in excess. War's young Spartan men were told to run throughout the country armed with daggers and kill Heliots at will in order to terrorize them and keep them servile. At war, slaves were servants to the warriors, cleaning their armor and cooking, even serving as light infantrymen occasionally. To keep their numbers up, Spartans encouraged Heliots to breed among themselves, and they were allowed to have some form of a family unit. Just like Spartan citizens in that unbelievably harsh state, Heliots were subjects of selective breeding, which is really, really morbid. The strong would live and the weak would be thrown out or even put to death on the spot. Spartans would also procreate with Heliot women to bulk up the numbers of the state's servants. This resulting children were called, I cannot pronounce it, ranking somewhere between a slave and a free man. These people usually served in the citizen army or worked in some low-level public service. Girls, however, who were born from a Spartan and a Heliot would be simply discarded. Slave revolts in ancient Greece. Yay! They decided to tell people what they personally thought about them. This is generally, that's what slave revolts are about. They're like, we're sick and tired of this. We're not going to take it anymore. I'm pretty sure they did not say Sparta. I can just imagine somebody deciding to do a slave revolt and go, I am sick and tired of this bullshit. We're going to come together and we're going to fight. It's just a thought. This is probably what they said. Just a thought about it. Slave revolts were uncommon in ancient Greece, although slaves' escapes were not. Slaves who escaped did so just to be free. Slave miners worked under extraordinarily harsh conditions in the dark, although many were needed to perform skilled and unskilled tasks outside the pits as well. Many slaves were constantly overworked and surely worked to death at times. Also, many were stigmatized or branded by their owners, and kept in chains by their contractors' bosses. The Athenian ruler, I can't pronounce his name, thought that it would be the city's benefit to invest its funds in such slaves. However, during the Peloponnesian War, many, or as more than 20,000 slaves who managed to escape Athens were minors. This was the only recorded successful revolt of slaves in the history of slavery in ancient Greece. And it is funny as heck. You imagine suddenly you don't have 20,000 people and they're off somewhere else? Be like, yeah, we're fucking tired of this bullshit and we're not going to take it no more. And they all laughed. It was like, yeah, like, I don't think they were looking for them. They were so busy, like, you had, like, Athens and you had Sparta, and everybody was like, they weren't paying attention to the miners. Or they were not paying attention to them. And they all ran away. They'd be like, yeah, you guys, you're not paying attention to us, so we're just going to leave. So, put a little humor into it. Because this is an educational channel. And we have to be humorous in some points. But it is, it's, in all seriousness, slavery was a very, very nasty business. And it was an institution that did not officially get abolished until society suddenly envisioned that world in which slaves were no longer needed, simply because other people decided that, hey, I'm going to do things for myself. I'm not going to let other people do things for me. And the whole idea of the self-interested person, or the self-employed person, or the person that goes out on their own and they do their own thing and they don't bring people with them. But yeah, and it was interesting when we talk about slavery and getting a little bit away from Greece. There was this mystery series that I read. I haven't read one of his books in, I think, like 10 years, which shows how old that I'm getting to be a very old person. Sorry. He was taught, it was a mystery series that took place in Ireland, which is a very beautiful country. And they're talking about this nun and her monk husband would go around go around Ireland. They would solve mysteries and stuff like that. It was a really great series. I don't know if he's even writing them anymore or whatever. I gotta go on Amazon and see if he is. If he is, I got a lot of books to read. And tell me, there was this one scene at the very end of the book where the nun and her monk husband discover this whole group of women and children that are about ready to be sold into slavery. And what is going on? What's going on is they're at this port, and they're going to be put on a ship that came from the Middle East. And they're all going to be sent over to the Middle East to be sold in the slave markets. And these are white women and white children. The author made it very clear what their skin color was. And they're all going to be sold to the Arabs to be slaves, to be prostitutes, to be whatever. And who paid the Arabs to go take their ship over to Ireland to personally to kidnap a certain section of the population, and that was the Pope. And the reasoning is these women and children were the wives of monks. And it was during a period of time when the Roman Catholic Church was forcing their celibacy rule on the Celtic Christian Church. Because for hundreds of years, the Celtic Church was independent of Rome. So, while the other priests of the Roman Catholic Church were required to be celibate, the monks and the nuns of Ireland were having babies, were getting married, were having large families. And the Pope decided that that was unacceptable. So I'm going to pay people that we can't stand, because they don't believe in Jesus. We're going to send them over to Ireland, kidnap these women and children, sell them to slavery to force these monks to become celibate. So this was a form of church-sponsored slavery, just to force them to be in line with the church. But in the story, the women are saved and they run back to their husbands, and it causes further divisions between the Celtic Church and the Roman Catholic Church. But there is historical evidence to indicate that there were wives and children of monks that were actually sold in slavery, and there is evidence that there is a segment of the Arabic not Arabic, sorry. Arabic is a language. Middle Eastern population that does have some Irish in them. Just by the fact that what happened back in the early 1100s, and maybe a little bit further. I gotta find out exactly when this happened, because it was mentioned at the back of the epilogue of the book, or the historical footnote of the book, when the Pope actually did this. But it was a way of forcing them to start practicing what the church had declared to be acceptable. But going back to ancient Greece and a little bit going into ancient Rome, you could not survive in those period of times unless you owned a slave. There was no abolitionists out there that that viewed slavery as wrong. Let's see if I can try to find it. Um, um, uh, um, let's see here. Okay. Um, let's see here. Okay, so, this is from Irish Times. So, yes, there is evidence that, that priests' wives were sold into slavery. Um, Says here, late 11th century, under the influence of supposedly modern Norman, add to the Irish Church spurned centuries of social custom in favor of certain lifestyles. It says here, Pope Gregory, I can't pronounce it, told priests to escape from the clutches of their wives. Pope Urban II ordered priests' wives to be sold into slavery and their children to be abandoned. Yeah. Um, so it was done. It was done. Um, yeah. So it was done. It was done under Pope Gregory. I believe that's what I. No, Pope Urban. Oh, but not Pope Gregory. Pope Urban. Pope Urban was the one that did it. Um, but this really does show that slavery, depending on if it was done in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, in medieval Ireland, it's not based on the color of your skin. It's based on different factors. One is how a society is constructed. And, the Greeks, they had evolved a lot. They were like, okay, human sacrifice is wrong, but this is right, so we're going to do this way, but we're going to abandon this. They just could not imagine a society in which there was no slaves. They could not imagine how could you function in society then you did not have people washing your body. They never thought, as far as hygiene was concerned, they could do it themselves. Um, this was how ingrained their dependence on the slave was. So people that do not come from Africa and people that have come from Africa or live in Africa have been enslaving each other for the same amount of time. It was only during the abolishing of the serf, definitely you can guess the plague had a lot to do with it. It was really funny, was there was this monk that was walking down the road, and he saw this husband and wife who he knew owned a huge amount of land. And they were fighting over a piece of equipment. And he laughed at them because they didn't know how to use it. Because all of their servants had either died of the plague or had left, had run away, leaving the husband and wife not knowing how to farm their own land. So their land ended up getting sold. And it was some of the land actually ended up getting sold and bought by people that had once been their servants, which was really interesting. It was funny. He was laughing all the way. He probably told the other monks, hey, look what I saw down the road. But when you have, if you look at today's society, we get up in the morning and we go and we take a shower, we take a bath, and we cook ourselves some breakfast, and we don't need servants to do this because our society, we have taught our children how to do things for themselves and not rely on other people. But if you look at like royalty, yes, they know how to clean themselves, but they also have servants for things that they can't do because either they don't have the training to do it or they are naturally fearful they're going to break something. But slavery was not considered an evil institution. It was, people just could not see what was wrong about exploiting other human beings. And it took a very long time. It took an extremely long time before those things that were considered socially normal to be considered socially abhorrent. And like anything that is tied directly to society, it is going to take a very long time for outdated ideas to become that way. So we just have to let things run their course. So anyways, so I hope you enjoyed this very, very long video about slavery in ancient Greece. I had a lot of fun doing the video. I love doing educational videos where I talk about things. Next month, I will do about women. This time around, I will have the books. I am going to start buying my books for my more, subject-centered videos like this one. But before people want to know why did I bring up what Pope Urban did to the Irish monks, it fits in with how people will use an institution, and they will use people that they don't like to get stuff done. And it also shows that slavery can be used as a weapon to force people to do what you want them to do, just as it can be used as a byproduct of a civilization that has become too dependent on that particular group of people. And really, when you become too dependent on another group of people to get stuff done, and you don't learn how to do stuff yourself, you end up going under. So, like I said, hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys around. Please be free to respond. If you post a question about the video and I don't have an answer, I will respond that I don't have an answer, but I will be looking it up because I like to expand on what I have learned. If you post a question and I can answer it, I will answer it. I will be citing the websites that I used in the video for copyright purposes and everything. So I will see you guys around. Until next time, may be happy, healthy, most importantly, be safe. And I want to leave with this note. Monday morning, I will be doing that ritual to Artemis. And later on that day, at night, I will be doing the ritual to Apollo. And I will officially have every single, one from Noramina all the way to Poseidon and Theseus done. And then I can move on to the other Hellenic holidays. So I will see you guys around. Till next time, may you be happy, healthy, most importantly be safe, and hail to the gods. Bye.